Natural selection is often considered the very engine of evolution. Is it possible for this process to do what evolution requires? Can our species be millions of years old? Our guest today will reveal both computer simulations and real-world genetic data showing what natural selection and mutations really do to the human population. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, big problems with natural selection with Dr. Rob Carter. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name's Donn Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science and other important facts validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Robert Carter, did his undergraduate work at Georgia Tech and then earned a PhD in marine biology at the University of Miami. Currently, he is a popular and much in-demand speaker for Creation Ministries International out of their U.S. office here in Atlanta, Georgia. His research centers on the field of human genetics, human history, and other issues related to biblical creation. Dr. Carter, it's always a joy to have you with us. Great to have you here. Listen, our topic today is big problems with natural selection. You're kind of poking at the sacred cow here, aren't you?
I absolutely am.
Yeah.
I hope to show that natural selection is not what evolution requires and can't do anything they need it to do.
Boy, that's a show I want to hear. So if you'll go to the board and help us,
Okay.
We'll be anxious to learn with you.
It's actually hard to know where to start. There's so many different things that we can say, but let's do it this way. Let's define what natural selection is first.
That's good.
We have to understand it's not magic.
No.
It's not like nature can think. It's not like the environment is actually doing anything active. It's not even survival of the fittest. That's actually a really bad word, bad phrase, because how do you define who's the most fit? It's not the biggest, no, it's not the one who survives. It's the one who has the most number of children.
Oh.
It's not the strongest and the fastest or the best eyesight, or it's the one who reproduces more. That's actually how to define it. So it's really, we shouldn't call natural selection. We could call it differential reproduction.
All right.
But those are horribly long scientific words. I mean, who would call it? So we just say it natural selection, nice and simple.
Right.
And if we have that as a definition, then we can continue to talk on the subject and actually know what we're talking about.
Okay.
Usually evolutionists use this and they switch meanings and change it up, and so people get really confused. But something else I want to point out, though. The idea of natural selection is not contrary to the Bible. I mean, it's kind of obvious. Some things have more offspring than others. Duh. And sometimes if an organism better fits its environment, it'll have more offspring than if it doesn't fit the environment. Okay, that's actually common sense.
It really is.
It really is. And so natural selection is one of those places where the creationists and evolutionists will often argue over it, even though they both agree with it.
If they'd stop fighting and listen, they would find agreement.
Yes, and so what we want to do is we want to actually look at this thing we're both tussling over and look at it in such a way where we can actually discriminate between what the evolutionist wants it to be and what the creationist wants it to be. And if we can do that, then we're going to have a big leg up on most people in this, as this argument is concerned. Now, here's a simple example. Imagine that there's a couple of dogs. And among these dogs, there's a couple of genes for fur length. In this case, this dog has one gene for long and one gene for short hair, and this dog also has one long and one short gene, meaning they've got medium length fur. Now, if these dogs have puppies, some of the puppies are going to get 2 long-haired genes, some are going to get 2 short-haired genes, and some will get a long and a short, one from each parent. And so we might get something like this, long, 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 short, and short, short. Now, why do I have these X's? Because what I didn't tell you is that these dogs are migrating north. And now all of a sudden winter comes, or an abnormally cold winter comes. And what happens is that only the dogs with long hair survive. The ones with medium and short hair, they die out. Natural selection.
Yeah.
This is common sense, but you don't have to die for natural selection to work.
Creationists have no problem with that.
No problem.
They understand it the same way.
Yeah, no problem at all. But it's not about death. It's about reproduction. If these dogs on average had a couple of fewer puppies than these dogs, the same thing would happen. It would just take more time. So it's just mathematically starting from here, and if you cold adapt the dogs, you would expect some adaptation to happen where these dogs in the final population can better handle cold than
Makes
before.
sense.
In fact, part of the fact that species can change over time, that tells us that God is a brilliant creator. Mm-hmm. I couldn't create something that changes over time like this. But God put into his initial creation the ability to adapt to new circumstances. And if he hadn't, most species would already be extinct.
Right. He built adaptability in.
Yeah. So natural selection is actually part of God's economy.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles Darwin wanted to make it something other than that. We'll get to that as we go. But if we're talking about selection, we also have to define what a species is. I mean, Charles Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species, his method was natural selection. He said natural selection can explain the species, but he couldn't define species. And we can't define it today.
I was going to ask you, you can't define species?
No, that's a liger. That's a half lion, half tiger.
Oh.
And it's perfectly capable of having more kittens. These are not like a mule. This is a healthy, happy animal that can reproduce itself. In fact, all of the cats, from the house cat to the tiger, can interbreed.
I didn't know.
Now, house cats and tigers don't interbreed because one of them always eats the other.
Right.
But if you take the big cats and the medium cats, they can interbreed. The medium cats and the small cats, they can interbreed. So you actually have an interbreeding spectrum. All of the cats, one species.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
True for dogs, too.
Okay.
Dogs, wolves, coyotes, African jackals, they can all interbreed. That's one species. So what's a species? Well, if we look at the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds. And every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. What's a kind? Is that a species? No. This word, in context, it's saying here that God created independent groups of animals, and they're designed to reproduce within themselves and not reproduce with other groups. Now, what are the boundaries between the kinds? God didn't tell us. But through science, we can explore it, and it looks like the kind is at the level taxonomically we would call the family, which is why all the dogs can interbreed, and why all the cat species can interbreed, and other many examples like that. So this whole idea of natural selection, the origin of species and things like that, we have to define our terms correctly.
We sure do.
I have no problem with natural selection taking a kind and speciating it to the point where we have black bears, brown bears, and polar bears. No problem at all. But if dogs turn into cats, that would be a problem. Now this leads to another idea. We've all seen depictions of the tree of life. I mean, Charles Darwin wrote a tree of life in his notebook in like the 1830s or something. So we have a common origin of all species leading to all species alive today. Well, there is a concept which is actually false that a lot of evolutionists want to tell us that this is what the creationists believe. I would call it the creationist lawn, where God created species, and if they've survived until today, they haven't changed, or maybe they've gone extinct. That is false. That is not what we believe. In fact, even creationists before Charles Darwin didn't necessarily believe that. I'm sure a couple of them did, some of them did, but a lot of them did not. They would have this sort of a concept, and this is my concept and a lot of my colleagues, where we have God creating different kinds, independent groups of animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, whatever it is, and over time, these have speciated. But they all have a common root here, and they have independent origins. So when we're talking about natural selection, yeah, natural selection might be able to do this, but it can't do that. That's the point. Also, a lot of people think that natural selection and evolution are the same thing. And it is not true. And I say it's not true because natural selection was alive a long time before evolution came around. Edward Blythe, he's not a young earth creationist, but he would be called a special creationist. He believed God created things. And he wrote a series of papers 25 years before Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. And I've read these papers, and in those papers, he's got the whole natural selection thing already worked out. But to him, it was a process that God used to preserve species. To Darwin, it's a process used to create species.
Okay.
And the way it preserves species is by killing off the less fit. So Darwin didn't invent this idea. Evolution and natural selection are not the same thing, and I can happily accept natural selection as mathematical and real in the real world without having to be an evolutionist.
Fascinating.
But most students don't know that. There's also an example in the Bible of natural selection. After Jacob had been working for his father-in-law for many years, he decided he wanted to, build up his own wealth. And he said, let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb and a spotted and speckled among the goats, that they shall be my wages. He's saying, don't give me big flocks. Just let me take the ones you don't want, the ones that have a little bit of color in them. Those are going to be the ones I get. But then, whenever the stronger of the flock that's now all white were breeding, Jacob would lay some sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock. It's when the stronger ones were there, and he had the stronger sheep were breeding and not the weaker ones. So the feebler would be his father-in-law's, and the stronger would be Jacob's. And what happened over time?
Jacob's flock grew phenomenally.
Grew phenomenally,
yeah. And
it was all the spotted ones, starting from a white flock. He went through an artificial selection scenario. He changed the species. He changed the coat color, and coat color is a very important thing. I mean, polar bears have white coats on purpose.
Yeah.
Black bears wouldn't do very well in the woods if they had white coats. So here we have in the Bible an extreme example of change in color of a species over time through, in this case, artificial selection. So of course things can change. There's an example right there of things changing. Now, this is a clip from our Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary.
Okay.
Here we have two bacteria. This one is mutant. It's got a defective pore, so the antibiotics can't get into it, but food has a hard time getting into it. This one's got the normal pore, so food gets in, but so does the antibiotic. In this case, which one's going to live and which one's going to die? The healthy bacteria dies with the antibiotic. The mutant lives. Even if it grows slowly, even if it's decrepit, even if it's falling apart, it can survive and the healthy one dies. So what is natural selection doing in this case?
It seems backwards.
It's backwards.
That's right.
It's actually destroying the species.
Yeah.
It's focusing on things that are bad because it just happens that this bad thing gives it a survival advantage. But it grows really slowly. It's not nearly as fit as the other one when the antibiotic's not present.
Okay.
All known examples of natural selection involve a downward change, a backwardization if you want. It's something in the population that is actually bad, but is a selective advantage in some circumstances. Another example for humans would be sickle cell anemia. That is a debilitating disease. It hurts people, even when they're heterozygous for the disease. And yet, if you carry that trait, you have a greater chance of surviving childhood malaria.
Huh.
So you have a broken gene that it hurts, it's bad for you, but it's better to be sick than to be dead. And so all natural selection is doing is preventing us from going extinct, and yet, at the other hand, very often, it hurts us. And it usually removes some functional gene, like the sickle cell gene is a broken gene. The good gene's getting removed. Here's an example of selection from my own work. It's from a paper that I published with John Sanford in 2012, and we're looking at the human H1N1 influenza virus. Now, most people have heard of the swine flu. That's H1N1. Or the Spanish flu that hit the world right after World War I. That was H1N1. In fact, this is that Spanish flu. And this is the years. And all we did is we counted up the number of mutations that have accumulated in each virus over time. and we found this relationship.
That's a straight line.
It's a straight line. And then we noticed, we actually published this, nobody else noticed this, we noticed that in 2009, the human H1N1 virus that's been plaguing us since 1918 went extinct.
So no one's going to get that anymore?
No, we can still get the swine version of it, but the human version is gone. And the reason it went extinct is because if you look at this number of mutations, that's about 13% of its genome. So despite the fact that natural selection, that's the human immune system, natural selection, is getting rid of flu viruses, and any flu virus that's decrepit or reproduces slowly will not escape the human immune system. So it should be producing superbugs. But it didn't produce a superbug. It made the bug run out mutation-wise to the point of extinction.
Huh.
Now, to put that in perspective, this many generations of the influenza virus is about the number of generations that evolutionists believe humans and chimpanzees have been separated.
So what does that mean?
It means our species can't be around for millions of years.
Yeah.
And if we can't have been around for millions of years ago, we won't last millions of years into the future. Here's another clip from our Evolution's Achilles Heels documentary. This is a human cell, a fertilized egg. Well, when that egg divides, it adds mutations. 1 to 3 mutations for every cell division. We have about 100 trillion cells in our bodies. That means that we carry every single possible mutation in us right now. And the older we get, the more mutations we get. So we are going to die if we don't get hit by a bus or eaten by a bear. Accumulating mutations will kill every one of us.
Wow.
As an individual, but it also applies to the species. You see, not only do we die when we get old because of mutation accumulation, but as mutations accumulate from one generation to the next, well, every generation adds about 100 mutations that didn't exist in the generation before. So these people actually related to me, since my ancestors. Wow. These people aren't, but look, every generation we add more and more mutations. So natural selection can't remove them because you can't die 100 times over. And yet all these mutations are actually bad in some way. This is a rate at which a species like humans or elephants or giraffes, we cannot withstand this mutation accumulation over a long period of time. So I claim that accumulating mutations will kill us as individuals and will kill our species. All complex life. Maybe bacteria can withstand this, fine, but all complex life is doomed because of accumulating mutations after natural selection has done its work.
This is kind of daunting, and
yes.
We need to Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Rob Carter, and we're talking about big problems with natural selection. I've kind of come to the conclusion that natural selection isn't going to save us.
That's true.
So can you draw some conclusions for us?
Sure. After we've said all of that, we can conclude that natural selection is unable to remove most mutations from a population. In other words, it's unable to slow down decay. It does slow it down to a degree, but decay keeps on happening anyway.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, well, I'll accept natural selection. Sure, great. People born without heads, they don't have any babies. Okay, cool. But it can't do much more than that. But also, it doesn't add anything new. Darwin didn't know that. Natural selection can only remove stuff. It can't add stuff. Now, most evolutionists say, oh, but mutations, they add new things to the genome. Yeah, but we've seen what happens with mutations. Most of them are bad. They've got to be removed. And even if a beneficial mutation could happen, it's going to be, what, like 1,000,000 to 1?
Yeah.
So you got to remove 1,000,000 mutations from the genome? Mathematically, it can't happen.
There's no way to do it.
Yeah.
And so the 1 is going to get lost in the 1,000,000.
Yeah. And so once we get rid of natural selection, what's evolution got? natural selection also can't prevent extinction. It might delay it a little bit, but it can't prevent it. And that's a huge problem because actually in evolutionary theory, new species must form. Here, we're just trying to keep them from going extinct. And therefore, natural selection does not do what Darwin needed.
No.
At all. I think Darwin realized this after he wrote The Origin of Species, because in one of his later books, he said, people criticized me because I put too much power for natural selection. They were right. And then he introduced sexual selection and group selection and kin selection, which are things that are still being debated today. And population geneticists really don't like those ideas because they don't really work.
They don't work either.
No,
So
they do not.
they're just an adaptation of natural selection.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
So where do you go after this? After all that's said and done, what do? Let's put all this stuff in a biblical context. Let's read Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, that's Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Why does natural selection even exist? Because problems are happening because of sin.
Right.
You see, Adam rebelled against God. There was no death in the world and suffering before Adam rebelled against God. And when he did that, in Genesis 3:17, God said, "Cursed is the ground because of you, Adam. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life." That's where all this junk comes from. And yet it's not the dirt that's cursed. It's not just the ground. It's the universe. Mm-hmm. I mean, Paul here in Romans 8, he hits on this creation theme multiple times. The creation waits with eager longing. The creation was subjected to futility, in hope that the creation itself would be set free from its bondage to corruption. The whole creation, the Greek behind that means everything. Everything has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. That's the natural selection stuff.
He sees the going down of the world.
Yeah, it's all going down despite the fact that natural selection might be operating. So what? The biblical picture is everything is winding down. And therefore, we need a redeemer.
There's the word I was looking for. Hope.
Hope. There's no hope in science.
No.
No, none at all.
Right.
Revelation 21 here toward the end of the Bible. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning nor crying nor pain anymore, for the former things are passed away. And natural selection is one of these former things.
Natural selection is part of the former things that passes away.
That's right. There's not going to be any suffering, any death, or any decay when God restores all things. Yeah. And to restore means there was something that actually got marred.
Yeah. And
that thing that got marred was the initial creation, which was created perfect without decay, therefore no natural selection.
Most of us don't really understand how catastrophic Adam's fall was, do we?
Most people don't. And it's because it's not taught in most churches.
That's right.
But it is profound in the way it's influenced all of us.
And if we don't understand how catastrophic the fall was, we don't understand how glorious our redemption is.
That's true too.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And this is an incredible thing. I don't think I've ever preached a funeral that I didn't refer to this verse. One of the best parts of heaven's what's not there. No tears, no suffering, no loss, and we might say no mutations.
Yeah, no mutations.
Because we were restored to what was there before the fall.
Yeah. Right now, we couldn't live in heaven for millions of years because our bodies pick up mutations over time. We'd die eventually.
But when he appears in the sky, we'll be made like him.
Yes.
And I wonder if that means the mutations are taken away.
Oh, I believe so.
Yeah, I do too.
And perhaps through the tree of life. In the very next chapter of the Bible says, first of all, there's no more curse. And the tree of life reappears.
Yeah.
And the leaves are for the healing of the nations.
You know, Dr. Carter, having you on has been a tremendous blessing to me because it's shown me how the debate has to continue because of the new information. The whole genetic side of this argument isn't very many years old. It's kind of fresh that we've really understood this.
Yes.
And then you have to understand the genome before you can understand its implications. And that takes time to develop. And you've done a tremendous job. And we need to say to our viewers that they need to continue to educate themselves because the debate has changed as we've gathered new information. Isn't that true?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I like to end everything with 1 Peter 3:15.
Please do that.
It says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense," including things like genetics and natural selection.
That's right.
"To anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, Well, I've got good reason for the hope that is in me, besides the promises that Christ made. There's good scientific indication the Bible actually is true. And yet do it with gentleness and respect.
Sure.
And we are called to be respectful to our adversaries, and yet to stand firm and confident on the Word of God at the same time.
Thank you, sir. You've done a great
You're
service.
welcome. You're
Keep up the good work. And my friends, I want you to understand that you can't live out this apologetic verse in Peter if you don't stay fresh on these issues. We hope today's show has helped. But get the books, get the tape, continue to learn and grow so that you can give a good defense. And then maybe when we get to heaven, we'll see your neighbors there because of your witness. I hope that's true. And always remember this, my friend, it's God's view that He created you. And that should be your worldview too. See you again soon here on Origins. And until then, God bless you, my friend.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.